Let's make it absolutely clear. If wasn't for Western involvement, these attacks would not be taking place. The technologies being used are developed by the West for Ukraine. The intelligence information is provided exclusively by the West for Ukraine. The manufacturing is done outside of Ukraine to avoid Russian interdiction. Um, yeah, again, this is not an example of Ukraine escalating against Russia. This is the collective West escalating against Russia. This is, a reflection of the reality that, NATO is actively engaged, or NATO nations are actively engaged in combat operations against Russia. That is basically, achieving, an existential threat to the, survival of Russia.
Well, let's see, in Europe, there's a lot of talk about the need to bring the war to Russia. There's a lot of talk about mass producing long-range weapons to strike Russia. I guess, when do they cross the point when for Russia to do nothing is more dangerous than hitting back, I guess, because we seem to be crossing this, well, if we haven't already, we would cross it fairly soon, it seems.
No, it's been crossed a long time ago. You have major Western nations, Germany, France, Great Britain, and others openly articulating the necessity to engage Russia in open armed conflict by the end of this decade, 2029, 2030. We now have Pistorius, the defense minister of Germany, openly saying that Russia is our enemy and we need to prepare to go to war. And now they're preparing the weapons of war, specifically to conduct long-range strike missions inside Russia. So, I mean, again, I'm not a Russian leader, and there's a good reason why I'm not. A, I'm American, and B, you wouldn't want me to be your leader because we'd be at war with Europe right now. I'd be launching preemptive strikes. I'd be taking out production facilities. I'd be destroying decision-making centers, and I'd be implementing in full effect the Karaganov doctrine.
Well, yeah, it appears though that, yeah, no, it's very strange if you listen to the rhetoric 4 years ago, the caution and something that sounded like rational arguments and concern about being participants in the war, where the rhetoric now is very far apart. But a lot of these attacks on Russia now they very evidently so has gone through the Baltic states. Then we've seen especially Estonia and Latvia. Of course, they have to transit through Lithuania as well if this is going to work. But we also heard that some statements from the Russian foreign intelligence services arguing that Ukraine is preparing strikes on Russia from Latvian territory. I mean, once the Russians make these statements, aren't they committing to something? Because if they say we know it's happening from Latvia, but we're not going to do anything, it seems that this will become an impossibility.
Well, yes, I think it's gone beyond the concept of a possibility to a probability, and maybe even an absolute certainty. I think Latvia is being marked for death. I don't believe Russia. Again, I don't pretend to know anything about I do know Sergei Karaganov. You know Sergei Karaganov, and you know that he's a serious man. He's a rational actor. He's not an irrational actor, and he's somebody whose voice has influence. And Sergei Karaganov and others like him who advise or whose opinions are heeded by the Ministry of Defense and the Russian leadership, have articulated a very sound, rational case for Russian military intervention, decisive. I don't believe these people who speak of Russian military intervention are playing the game of managed escalation. I think we're beyond that. The reason why we're where we're at, and I don't blame Vladimir Putin, he was a genius and still is a genius. He has been managing the escalation ladder in perfect form, because never once prior to this most recent era in this war did Ukraine pose an existential threat to the security of Russia. It was always the potential, but we know that the West has been articulating in favor of the strategic defeat of Russia since the beginning of the special military operation. We know this, and we know that they have been pushing Russia, pushing Russia, pushing Russia. Russia sets a red line, it gets it gets crossed. Russia resets the red line. It gets crossed. Now Russia, uh, resets it for a reason because the crossing of the red line, um, was designed, was done by design to get a Russian overreaction, so that the West could mobilize support and solidify support on behalf of Ukraine. It was Russia's goal and objective to keep the West, um, you know, from being able to do that. So you don't overreact. You allow the red lines to be crossed because at the end of the day, it didn't change the ultimate calculation. Russia still prevailed on the battlefield. Or Russia's still prevailing on the battlefield today. The Special Inspector General of Operation Atlantic Resolve has published a report recently that says Russia's dominating across the battlefield. So all those pro-Ukrainian social media platforms just stick it in your ear. The United States has spoken. And even that report, is very conservative in terms of, giving a lot of credit to Ukraine and NATO that simply isn't reflected by reality. But their conclusions are Russia maintains operational strategic dominance across the spectrum of this conflict. And that's what Russia has been seeking to do, to wear not just Ukraine down, but the collective West down through a war of attrition. And they're still succeeding. But what's happened is because Russia has allowed the collective West to cross red lines, they've crossed the ultimate red line. Because in the past, you always, as you said, the West always went, we want to avoid being able to be categorized as an active participant in the conflict. We always want to create that air of ambiguity. There's no more ambiguity. They're just straight up doing it, straight up saying it. And now we come to Sergei Karaganov. We probably should do a good job of introducing him to a Western audience. This is one of the premier political military analysts in Russia, a man who has advised Russian presidents from Boris Yeltsin to Vladimir Putin. In 2023, he articulated in writing and spoken word the need for the West to be decisively countered by Russia. He was in favor of the preemptive use of nuclear weapons, that when the West articulates a strategy calling for the strategic defeat of Russia, Russia has a duty and responsibility to respond and nip this in the bud before it manifests itself in something that does real harm to Russia. And he famously said that his calculation is that no American leader will trade Boston for Poznan, meaning Russia could just take out a Polish city with a nuclear weapon and Europe will do nothing. It'll intimidate Europe and the United States will do nothing because they don't want to trade Boston for Poznan. Vladimir Putin came out immediately and said, I don't agree with Sergei Karaganov. That's not who we are. That's not what we do. In 2024, as the West continued to push, he appointed Sergei Karaganov to be the head of the review process for the Kremlin's strategic nuclear posture review. In 2025, the Russians published a new strategic nuclear posture that basically was the Karaganov doctrine, basically saying that if nuclear powers provide conventional military capability to a non-nuclear power and use that to strike into the strategic depth of Russia that threatens Russia's strategic infrastructure, that Russia is therefore empowered to use nuclear weapons in response. They can treat this as a nuclear attack. That's exactly what's happening. People need to understand that this doctrine was published last year. It was covered. We talked about it. Everybody talked about it. Everybody knew this. And yet the West is doing something now that is just flagrantly crosses that red line because they believe Russia is bluffing. And so now they've crossed the red line and Ukraine is doubling down because Ukraine smells blood. Ukraine is dying. And for the first time, Ukraine's going, wait a minute, we're doing real harm here. Let's keep doing it. Let's keep doing it because they want NATO to become engaged. That's their goal. That's their salvation. And so Ukraine is just doubling down, throwing caution to the wind. In a week and a half time, the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum opens up. This is like the premier, thing. It's bigger than Davos. Everybody in the West knows Davos. St. Petersburg International Economic Forum swamps it. It's bigger, more participants, more money, more everything. You think the Russians are going to let Ukrainian drones come out of the Baltics and threaten this? You think that's going to happen? You think they're going to let this happen? No, not at all. I see nothing but bad things, bad tidings. I think the West has gone too far. I think there will be hell to pay. I don't know if Russia limits it to Latvia. If I were the Russians, I wouldn't. I would take out the production facilities in England, in Germany, in Denmark, all identified production facilities associated with the FP5 and other drones. I would take out German companies involved in guidance and control, and I would even take out Ramstein. Maybe not. Maybe that's an American base, but I would threaten to take out Ramstein in a follow-on attack where the intelligence is gathered and disseminated. But the West has to be struck a blow, and I would eliminate Kiev once and for all. I think it's time to find out what a dozen Oreshniks can do to downtown Kiev. And I think it's time to show the Ukrainians that that's the fate of all of your cities if you want to continue this war. Russia, Vladimir Putin said on May 9th that he wants this war to wrap up. A lot of people went, oh, that's a sign of Russian weakness. Russia's willing. No, it's a sign of Russian recognition of their strength, and it's time to flex their muscles. The day of restraint, I believe, is over. I believe we're moving to a very dangerous period because now we get to answer the question of what will the United States do when Russia strikes a NATO country? How will Article 5 be treated?
Yeah, I spoke to Karaganov last week, and he, well, on this program, and he was making the point that in the past he was representing a small minority who said it's time to retaliate directly against the Europeans, but now he says he represents the overwhelming majority. So he already had all this pressure building up on the Kremlin that they had to choose a different path. This dilemma: do they retaliate against NATO and risk going up the escalation ladder, or did they look the other way and again risk emboldening NATO? That they always went with the second option, but now the pressure was mounting so much, and just at this point when all this pressure is mounting on Putin to take a harder line, we see these massive drone attacks and just uncontrolled celebrations in Europe, and this is what's so concerning. It's as if they don't see what's coming next. I mean, they use all these terms like, because bad for Russia, they think is good for us. Before you use this term that, the people online, the pro-Ukrainian bloggers or social media activists, it's not even pro-Ukrainian. These are the if Ukraine had implemented the Minsk agreement on anything like this, which they always opposed, Ukraine will be intact now. This is these people are destroying Ukraine. It's quite insane. But my concern is what the Europeans are celebrating now, which is that they're having the attacks on Russia is having a growing impact on Russian security. And they seem to be making a significant dent in the Russian energy. Again, I'm not sure how much, but at least it seems to be enough to create problems for the Russians. And if this is the case, that means the Russians can't afford to look the other way anymore. I don't know, how are you assessing the attacks on the Russian energy security or energy? Because, I mean, this is the irony. We should be happy that we weren't making a dent. Once we start making a dent, the calculations they have to change, don't they, on the Russian side?
Look, last November, I was in Moscow and I interviewed somebody affiliated with the Russian Duma, State Duma, involved in the committee on the protection of energy infrastructure from drone attacks. I'm sure it had a more Russian name than that, but he was on it, and I was surprised by the frankness of his conversation. I actually published it on the Russia House. I think many people ignored it at the time because it's people don't like to dig deep into fact-based reality. They like to live in their little fantasy worlds. I'm going to republish it and ask people to listen to it because it's important what he said at the time. He said that these attacks were taking place, but that the real damage done was minimal, that Russia was able to mitigate the damage and then repair the facilities and bring them back into order. So, the strategic impact was not, which is why, again, it's not that Karaganov's arguments became, again, I don't believe Vladimir Putin responds to pressure from Sergei Karaganov or anybody else. That's not how the game plays. And I don't think Sergei Karaganov is promoting himself as a man who has intimidated Putin into changing his mind. Sergei Karaganov has taken a stance, and Vladimir Putin has said, no, the damage being done doesn't rate an overreaction. But now the damage equation has changed. It's not that Sergei Karaganov's arguments, that Putin's been pressured. Putin's a pragmatic guy, and he's looking at it. The damage being done now to Ukrainian energy infrastructure is real. and it's not easily mitigated, and it's not easily repaired, meaning that when you do this damage, it's long term. And Russia can't afford long term damage. Um, again, there's things that happen in Russia that we're not aware of, and I believe Russia. The idea that Russia operates on the margins is absurd. I believe Russia probably has strategic reserves just like everybody else, and I believe that they're able to ride this out because you see a lot of people talking about Russia's, export volumes having dropped significantly, but the potential for, the production of, refined products for export is being impacted. At some point in time, the reserves run out, and if you haven't brought this potential back up, you're going to have a gap, and it's going to be meaningful. It's not Vladimir Putin's job to allow Russia to get to the point where you have meaningful impact. His job is to prevent that from happening. So, this is my way of answering your question. I believe that between 10 and 20% of Russia's export production capacity has been damaged to an extent beyond that which it was being impacted in November. That this damage will take months to repair. And that if Russia doesn't nip this in the bud now, by the time they repair it and bring it back online, the reserves that are currently carrying them through this process will be depleted, and then you're going to have a real and significant impact. And that's why Russia needs to act now. And I also think that the Ukrainians become more and more emboldened. You don't want. We know what the consequences of an attack on the Kremlin will be: fatal for everybody. But if you're a Russian, you don't want the Kremlin attacked. You don't want to wait for that to happen. You see the Ukrainians moving in that direction. This is the direction they are heading. It's inevitable. You see the West backing up. You see the rhetoric, and the damage is being done. This is the moment of decision right now. If you wait, you allow the Ukrainians to do significant, meaningful harm of an existential nature. Right now, Russia has the capacity to absorb, repair, and move on if the threat can be terminated. So now is the moment of decisive action. And I again, I don't want to speak on behalf of anybody. It's just assessments, and as we all know, assessments can be wrong. Um, but I have to say, on May 9th, the whole scene around Victory Day was. Look, you're a specialist. You lived in Russia. You know the Russians. This was a different May 9th than I've seen in the last 4 years since the special military operation began. This was a May 9th of uh, deathly seriousness. Um, at the embassy, the ambassador spoke incessantly about unconditional surrender, unconditional surrender, unconditional surrender, linking Nazi Germany and the Ukrainian government in a way that had never been done before. They spoke of Germany as a permanent enemy, not as a former enemy that Germany is the enemy today, is the enemy. This was the language. Dmitry Medvedev, who has always been sort of the bad, crazy cop to Putin's good, sane cop, um, you know, wrote an article in RT. What's the importance of RT? RT English. It's an article written for the West to read. It's designed for Western consumption, but it's an article that speaks with the force of the Russian government. This is Russian state media. This isn't Medvedev putting a social media post out on X. This is RT, Russian state media, publishing a major article written by a man who used to be the president of Russia, used to be the prime minister of Russia, and currently is the number 2 on the National Security Council. And the article is devastating for Europe. It pretty much endorses the Karaganov diet. And Karaganov, the day before, had another interview that basically hammered home the same points. The sense I get in having watched Russia, monitored Russia, et cetera, is that Russia has reached the point of decision. And unless something fundamentally changes, such as the unconditional surrender of Ukraine today, I think we're going to see decisive action before the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum begins to preempt any potential attack. I'd be curious to be a fly on the wall, although that's an insult to the Chinese. I'm sure their sanitation is such that there are no flies on the wall. But there should be a fly on the wall in the conversations between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping about this, because China was extraordinarily tough on Trump about Taiwan. And the Chinese know that Ukraine is as important to Russia as Taiwan is to China. And so, the Financial Times playing their MI6 stupid mind games, putting out this stuff about how, Xi Jinping told Trump that Putin overstepped. Hey, just the simplistic stupidity of this. Andrei Ilnitsky, former lieutenant general advisor to Shoigu when he was Minister of Defense, and the author of the concept of mental warfare. This isn't mental warfare. Mental warfare is actually carefully crafted, designed to get in there, latch in, and rip. What the British did here was just crude and stupid, and you could immediately see all the corrupted social media outlets that immediately jump on and say, aha, aha. I mean, it's just brain dead people. No, that's not the case at all. But I do believe that this is a very important meeting and that, look, Russia needs China. There's no doubt about that. Russia needs China and China needs Russia. And there's no doubt in my mind that this meeting may go down in history as sort of the modern day version or the present day version of the February 4th, 2022 meeting where Vladimir Putin flew to China, to Beijing, met with Xi Jinping on the eve of the initiation of the special military operation. I have a feeling that there will be conversations had that at least allow the Chinese to be positioned for about for what is about to happen.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking as well, because, well, Trump just left and Putin has arrived in Beijing, and I'm assuming if the Russians are now planning to, dramatically change their posture in this war, that they would discuss this at length with the Chinese first. So I'm assuming as well that this is something they're discussing because, again, there is no status quo which they can hold on to. It's not just where they are today, the drone attacks, but the Russians can see exactly what direction this is going. The Chinese can see this. So I think the hatred of Russia in Europe has blinded